Right, so whilst we continue to follow the events that have been unfolding in the West Bank as it comes under even further siege, as more and more people are being displaced, it is not solely, of course, Israel that are doing the displacing there. The Palestinian Authority, Israel's pliant skivvies, the very body supposedly meant to represent Palestinian interests in the West Bank, have been complicit in this illegal displacement too, betraying the Palestinian people in the worst ways possible, thinking if they placate Israel enough, they'll still get their share. Well, it looks like they're going to end up sorely disappointed, as the fact remains they are still Palestinian, therefore are still and always will be secondary to the racist ideologies of Zionism. And if they were looking for a reward here for what they've been willing to do, then they probably got the one they most deserved. Right, so Israel's recent atrocities in the West Bank have, as my other video on the West Bank tonight explained in more detail, displaced more Palestinians than at any time since the 1967 war. Entire communities have been and are being uprooted, with tens of thousands forced to flee their homes. In Tulkarem and Jenin, Israeli forces have destroyed critical infrastructure, leaving civilians without access to water, electricity, or medical care, all war crimes. Forced displacement is genocide, all adding to the ever-growing list of crimes the genocidal apartheid state of Israel is guilty of. This is a systematic campaign to erase Palestinian presence from the West Bank, and just as with Gaza, we're seemingly stuck helplessly watching. However, Israel isn't acting alone here, of course. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, the governing body there meant to protect Palestinian rights, has been aiding and abetting this displacement through security coordination with Israel, effectively turning the PA into a subcontractor for the Israeli occupation and rendering them complicit in what Israel had been doing in the West Bank, often with the PA's direct help or even with the PA acting on their behalf. Now, the Palestinian Authority was established in the 1990s as part of the Oslo Accords, with the promise of eventual Palestinian statehood, and they've clung to this ever since. I've spoken of this before. The PA's election-dodging President Mahmoud Abbas, now 87 years of age, who lost the 2006 election to run Palestine to Hamas's Ismail Haniyeh, and has refused to hold an election ever since, resulting in Gaza being led by Hamas and the West Bank remaining under Abbas's illegitimate rule. Something I'm sure is leaving a more and more sour taste in the mouth of the Palestinians in the West Bank being displaced under his orders as much as Israel's right now. But instead of working towards a goal of Palestinian statehood, though, the PA has become more and more deeply entangled with Israel's occupation. Through security coordination, the PA has helped Israel suppress dissent, arrest activists, and maintain control over the West Bank, or the part of it they're allowed to, the very body which is supposed to represent Palestinian interests actively helping Israel enforce its occupation instead. And for what? That promise of statehood. Well, how long is that promise going to hold for? How long have you been awaiting Israel to deliver upon it? A seat at the table, maybe. Viewed as an equal, perhaps. But how many more decades of oppression is it going to take for it to sink in that it's never going to happen? Perhaps not many at all, if this is what passes for their reward for services rendered, though. This story now brings us on to Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, yes, him again, who enters the story at this point, and here's an excerpt from the Cradle to explain why. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich signed an order on the 17th of February to seize 320 million Israeli shekels, $90 million, in Palestinian tax funds to use as compensation for families of Israelis affected by the war. There is no more moral and just signature than to prevent the Palestinian Authority from funding terrorism and to garnish its funds for the benefits of the families of terror victims. This is a necessary step in our national struggle against terrorism and against the Palestinian Authority that encourages it, Smotrich stated. In August, the finance minister confiscated 100 million Israeli shekels, nearly $27 million, from the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, accusing it of supporting terrorism. Yes, in recognition of the Palestinian Authority's stellar efforts on their behalf, Israel are going to call you terrorists and seize millions in tax funds from you and give it to the settlers, so that you think twice about your terrorism going forwards. What does Abbas say to that then? Thank you very much. Smotrich has ordered the seizure of $90 million in Palestinian tax revenues to be redirected to benefit illegal Israeli settlers in the West Bank. Money that belongs to the Palestinian people, stolen to fund the very settlers who are displacing them. The self-proclaimed chosen people resorting to petty thievery. But of course this isn't just theft, is it? It's also a blatant violation of international law. And yet still the Palestinian Authority has done nothing to challenge this and probably won't either. You see, because they become so intrinsically involved in all things Israeli in the West Bank, in order to maintain his own position and survive amongst this Israeli occupation and give this semblance of power that Mahmoud Abbas really doesn't have, the Palestinian Authority are being gutted to the point they are entirely financially dependent on Israel. Without those tax revenues, the PA can't pay its employees or maintain its institutions. Therefore, it's become part of a vicious cycle of dependency that keeps them complicit in its own oppression. But with the desire to see the Palestinians ethnically cleansed from Gaza completely, and likely from the West Bank thereafter, the PA's foolish choice to join Israel, instead of standing up to them, will not see them remembered fondly, I fear. But the betrayal doesn't stop there either. With Benjamin Netanyahu having now come out as fully committed to Donald Trump's so-called ethnic cleansing plan for Gaza, not that he had a lot of choice in that, with the hard right of his government, the Smotriches, loving the idea of ethnically cleansing Gaza and threatening to collapse the government if Netanyahu didn't go along with it. Instead of having the Palestinian Authority now overseeing certain roles governmentally and militarily in Gaza, the new plan envisions a Gaza Strip without Hamas, but also without the Palestinian Authority. Netanyahu has now stated there is no future role for the PA in Gaza, and you can't help but wonder if that is Smotrich's doing behind the scenes, or if the stance Egypt is suddenly taking on the redevelopment of Gaza, requiring the people of Gaza to very much remain in the Strip, and the tanks that Egypt have parked outside the Rafah border crossing playing a role in that decision too. Considering both of these anti-Palestinian Authority moves by Israel together, this isn't just about Gaza or the West Bank. It has to be seen for what it absolutely is, which is the complete erasure of Palestinian governance in Palestinian territory. The erasure of what it means to be Palestinian. Netanyahu's vision is a West Bank and Gaza Strip under direct Israeli control, part of Israel. To all intents and purposes, he's rubbed them out on the map already, hasn't he? With no Palestinian Authority or Hamas to stand in his way. And yet the PA has spent decades helping Israel maintain its occupation, only to be cast aside when they're no longer useful. Frankly, it's karma for Mahmoud Abbas and his acolytes. The harsh truth of the matter is that the Palestinian Authority have been used. They've helped Israel suppress dissent, maintain control, and enforce its occupation, for a false promise of statehood that was never going to be fulfilled by Israel. The PA will never be equals to them. They'll always be Palestinians to them, and in Israel's eyes, that means they'll always be second-class citizens, or less than human, or something depraved and abusive. Due to the choices made over so many years, and not least the last 16 where Abbas has squatted unelected in his role, the PA are seen as traitors by their own people. They've lost credibility, legitimacy, and support. And Israel have just moved on to the next stage of their ethnic cleansing plans, pursuing their vision of a greater Israel, with no regard for Palestinian rights or aspirations, they don't count, or those of anyone else getting in the way or occupying lands they've got their eyes on. It's a tragic betrayal, and one that should serve as a wake-up call for the international community, but for too many in hoc to the Israel lobby, they won't take the blindest bit of notice. The fate of the PA is their fate too, ultimately, though. We need to hold Israel accountable. We need to demand an end to the displacement, the sieges and the violence. And we need to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people who have been fighting for their rights for decades, let down by their own governance and the Palestinian Authority if they live in the West Bank. Silence is complicity, and we cannot afford to be complicit in this injustice. And Israel must have a day of reckoning, and its leaders a day in the dock at The Hague. Meanwhile, as the ceasefire officially ended in between Israel and Lebanon this morning, Israel have very much not left, to no surprise whatsoever, still intent on remaining in at least 5 areas. Not that they followed the rules of the ceasefire anyway. It was a non-ceasefire, having breached it more than 1,300 times, the ceasefire that never was, when only one side actually paid any attention to it. Well, the new governance in Lebanon has had plenty to say about that, as have Hezbollah. But with clashes between government and Hezbollah also making a part of this story, will they get their act together against Israeli transgressions or just take lumps out of each other? Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, and also support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, and I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.